Baltimore, 1981. A car turns onto a street in East Baltimore. The people on the block stop what they're doing, not because they recognize the driver, because they have never seen a car like this before. Gull-wing doors, brushed stainless steel body, a machine that looks like it came from a different decade entirely. The man behind the wheel is not from Hollywood, not from Wall Street, not from anywhere outside these few square miles of East Baltimore where he grew up. He lives here. He just moves differently. In a room somewhere in this city, it is raining indoors. Not a leak, not an accident, by design. In another building, a boardroom. Computers tracking numbers that most people in this neighborhood will never see in a lifetime. In Las Vegas, a ringside seat at a Sugar Ray Leonard fight, purchased without checking the price. In Beverly Hills, an $1,800 silk dress, bought for a woman, without hesitation. And on these streets, a product so pure that dealers were driving in from Washington, D.C. and Virginia just to get their hands on it. One man, one city, $50 million per year. And HBO spent years telling his story to the entire world. They just never used his real name. His name was Maurice King. The streets of Baltimore called him one thing, Peanut King. And everything you just heard, the car, the rain room, the boardroom, the $50 million, the HBO show built on his life, is only the beginning of his story. Baltimore, Maryland. Before The Wire made it famous, before the HBO cameras captured the specific geography of the towers and the corners and the police department that couldn't contain what was happening in the streets, Baltimore was already one of the most consequential drug markets in the eastern United States. Not because of its size. Baltimore is not New York, not Chicago, not Los Angeles. Baltimore is a mid-sized port city of 600,000 people sitting between Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia on the I-95 corridor. A city that produced Edgar Allan Poe and Billie Holiday and Thurgood Marshall. A city of neighborhoods so distinct and so insular that people from one part of town sometimes spent their entire lives without crossing into another. A black city. Chocolate city in its own right. A city where the Great Migration had brought black families from the Deep South through multiple generations, building communities, building institutions, building the specific social fabric that made Baltimore different from every other city on the East Coast. And a city with a heroin problem that predated the crack era by decades. The China White and the Mexican mud that flowed through New York's French Connection pipeline had been finding its way to Baltimore since the 1950s and 60s. By the time Richard Nixon declared his war on drugs in 1973, the White House estimated 10 tons of heroin crossed American borders every year. A significant portion of it ended up in Baltimore. State health officials estimated heroin reached 20,000 Marylanders in that era. Not just junkies, GIs returning from Vietnam, businessmen who called themselves chippers, high school students who started at parties and couldn't stop. The black market that served that demand was enormous, $900 million. That is what Baltimore's heroin market was worth annually in the early 1980s, $900 million in a city of 600,000 people. That is 3 times what the entire city of Baltimore spent on its public schools. 3 times. Federal prosecutors had been attacking Baltimore's drug infrastructure for years before Peanut King. A succession of big names had been locked up. John Liddy Jones, Bernard Big Head Brother Lee, and Little Melvin Williams, who ran his operation on the West Side with the specific quiet power that made him Baltimore's most enduring street figure. Each arrest was celebrated by law enforcement as a turning point. Each arrest was followed by someone else filling the vacuum. Because the $900 million market didn't disappear when a kingpin went to prison. It just changed management. And in East Baltimore, the management was Maurice King. Maurice Peanut King grew up in the same East Baltimore streets he would eventually control. The specific origin story of how he moved from the neighborhood into the drug trade, how a young black man from Charm City became the lord of the city's entire heroin economy, is the kind of story that the streets preserve in oral history rather than court documents. What is documented is what he built. And what he built started with a foundation of absolute product quality. Every other dealer in Baltimore in the late 1970s was putting out 3% pure heroin. 3%. That is the standard of the era. Cut, stretched, diluted with whatever was available to maximize the dealer's margin while giving the customer barely enough to feel the effect. 3% was what Baltimore expected. Peanut King put out 7 to 10% pure. In an industry where 3% was the norm, 7 to 10% was extraordinary. Not just better than the competition, more than twice as good as anything else on the market. The effect on his customer base was immediate and absolute. Word traveled the way word travels in cities that run on the underground economy, through the specific networks of people who know what is available and where the best product is and who is moving it. Dealers came from across Baltimore, then they came from beyond Baltimore. Washington, D.C., 40 miles south on Interstate 95. Dealers from D.C., who had heard about the purity coming out of East Baltimore, were making the drive specifically to buy from Peanut King. Virginia, Pennsylvania, cities across the East Coast, all of them making the trip to Baltimore because the best heroin in America in 1980 was being distributed by one man in East Baltimore. That specific quality advantage gave Peanut King something that most operators in the drug trade never achieve: the ability to name his price. When you have the best product and everyone knows it, you don't compete on price. You set the price, and everyone pays it. Because the alternative is going back to 3% purity from someone else. And once you've had what Peanut King was selling, going back feels like going backward. He built on that foundation methodically. His territory stretched from Cherry Hill across the Hanover Street Bridge all the way to Streeper Street in southeast Baltimore. Not one corner, not one block. A geography of East Baltimore that encompassed dozens of streets and hundreds of corners, all of it under his organizational control. His partner in all of this was Thomas Ricks. The streets called him Joe Dancer. Where Peanut King was the CEO, the face, the brand, the man whose style set the standard for what Baltimore wanted to be, Joe Dancer was the enforcer. The man who handled the situations that required a different kind of handling. The man who made sure that the organizational discipline Peanut King had built was maintained by everyone inside it. Together, they ran something that East Baltimore had never seen before: $50 million per year. Let that number breathe for a moment. $50 million flowing through one man's organization in one city in 1 year. In the early 1980s, when $50 million was worth significantly more than it is today. That kind of money required infrastructure that most people associate with legitimate corporations rather than drug organizations. And Peanut King built exactly that: an executive boardroom. In the early 1980s, when personal computers were brand new technology that most American businesses were still figuring out how to use, Peanut King had computers in his boardroom tracking every dollar moving through his operation. Not a ledger, not a notebook. Computers. The same technology that Wall Street was implementing to track financial transactions. Maurice King was using it to run the most sophisticated drug distribution operation in Baltimore history. At North Avenue and Chester Street, he built a facility that Baltimore's top narcotics detective, Captain Joe Newman, described in words that stopped the courtroom cold. A fully mirrored gymnasium, 2 universal workout systems, punching bags, a whirlpool, and a room where Peanut King could control the weather. He could make it rain inside, something the captain called jungle mist, inside a building in East Baltimore. Not a metaphor, not street exaggeration, a room with environmental control sophisticated enough to simulate rainfall and tropical humidity inside a structure built by a drug dealer in the middle of a Baltimore winter. His house in Silver Spring, Maryland, had no windows. Not one. Just surveillance cameras covering every exterior angle of the building, every approach, every blind spot that a rival or a law enforcement surveillance team might use. He was not taking chances with his security. And then the DeLorean, the car that no one in Baltimore had ever seen before he pulled up in it. Designed by John DeLorean, the General Motors executive who built a car company on his own reputation and audacity, the DMC-12 was everything that standard American cars of the early 1980s were not. Brushed stainless steel exterior, gull-wing doors that opened upward instead of outward, a rear-mounted engine, the specific visual language of the future, of Back to the Future, of science fiction, of a world that had not arrived yet. Peanut King drove one through East Baltimore every day. He brought that exotic life into Baltimore's street culture the way certain figures bring specific things into specific places, through the force of personality and the specific credibility that comes from being the man everyone in the city answers to. Men across Baltimore started copying everything he did. The bedroom slippers, $150 a pair. Men who had never paid that much for footwear in their lives started buying them because Peanut King wore them. The diamond pinky rings, $40,000 each, according to Peanut King himself. Men across Baltimore wanted rings that looked like his, the bejeweled Zippo lighter that he smoked with. A detail so specific and so carefully curated that it became part of the visual identity of what Peanut King was in Baltimore. He was not just a drug lord, he was a brand, and the brand extended beyond the streets. He donated to charities. He sponsored youth basketball teams in the same neighborhoods where his product was feeding addiction. He sat enthroned for photographs at Odell's nightclub, the famous Baltimore venue where the city's underground elite gathered, slim and sharp as a knife, surrounded by people who understood exactly what he represented. He thought nothing of flying to Las Vegas to watch a Sugar Ray Leonard fight, nothing of strolling Beverly Hills and buying a woman an $1,800 silk dress without checking the price. He laundered his money through Atlantic City casinos. He reinvested in stocks. He invested in real estate. Peanut King was not a man who spent everything he made. He was building. Detective Sergeant Gary Childs made a decision that would define the next 3 years of his career. He got in a camper, parked in East Baltimore, and watched. Not for a day, not for a week, for months. Documenting the specific patterns of how Peanut King's organization moved. Who came to whom? When deliveries happened. Where money moved. The specific organizational rhythm of a $50 million per year operation that had been running in plain sight for years because nobody had been patient enough to build the case from the ground up. Childs was patient enough. The FBI was building its own parallel case. Together they assembled the evidence that would eventually be presented at trial, not just the product and the cash, but the organizational architecture of what Peanut King had built. The computers, the boardroom, the specific management structure that made his operation function like a corporation rather than a street gang. In 1982, they moved. The news went out across Baltimore television. An FBI warrant was issued for the arrest of Maurice "Peanut" King, one of the biggest kingpins of the heroin trade in Baltimore history. When agents executed the search, what they found confirmed everything they had documented from the camper. 4 pounds of pure heroin, $300,000 in cash. The biggest drug bust in Baltimore City history. Peanut King was arrested. Joe Dancer was arrested. Their entire organization was exposed to the full weight of a federal prosecution that had been building for years. The trial lasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks of testimony, 5 weeks of evidence, 5 weeks of the federal government laying out in precise detail exactly what Maurice King had built in East Baltimore and exactly how many lives it had touched, and exactly what the cost of that operation had been to the neighborhoods it ran through. The jury convicted Peanut King and Joe Dancer on the CCE 848 charge, the continuing criminal enterprise statute, the Kingpin charge, the most serious federal drug charge in American law. The charge specifically designed for the men at the very top of drug organizations, the men who organized, supervised, and managed 5 or more people in drug trafficking. Before sentencing, Peanut King stood before the federal judge. He spoke, "Don't take my life away." The judge looked at this man in the bedroom slippers and the diamond rings who had driven a DeLorean through East Baltimore while feeding addiction to 20,000 Marylanders, who had built computers and boardrooms and jungle mist rooms while the neighborhoods he operated in deteriorated under the weight of what he was selling. The judge said 7 words that Maurice King has carried for 40 years. "You were dealing in human misery." 50 years in federal prison, his diamond rings confiscated, his necklaces, his furs, all sold at public auction at a fraction of their original value by people who had no idea whose fingers those rings had been on. The DeLorean, gone. The computers, gone. The boardroom, gone. The room where it rained inside, gone. Everything Maurice King had built reduced to evidence tags and auction lots. 5 years into a 50-year sentence, Peanut King is inside, thinking about the outside, not just thinking. Federal agents monitoring prison communications picked up something extraordinary on a payphone inside the federal facility where Peanut King was serving his sentence. His voice, speaking in code, arranging a heroin deal from inside federal prison. $750,000. He had been inside for 5 years. He had received a 50-year sentence. He was supposed to be finished, cut off from the operation, cut off from the money, cut off from the specific world he had built through his entire adult life. And he was on a prison payphone arranging a $750,000 heroin transaction. The additional charges added to his sentence. The government that had already given him 50 years gave him more. Because some men don't stop. Because the organizational intelligence that builds a $50 million per year operation doesn't go dormant just because the man is locked up. Because Peanut King, even inside federal prison, was still Peanut King. After Peanut King's arrest, something happened in East Baltimore that the federal prosecutors who celebrated the bust never fully anticipated. East Baltimore descended into chaos, not the productive chaos of a market reorganizing around new management. The destructive chaos of a power vacuum where every crew and every operator in the geography that Peanut King had controlled began fighting for their share of a market that had been organized under one man's discipline. Disputes that Peanut King would have resolved became shootings. Territorial conflicts that his organizational structure had managed became wars. The $900 million Baltimore heroin market that had operated with the specific efficiency of a corporation under one man's management became a war zone the moment that man was removed from it. Academic historians who studied the Baltimore drug war documented what the police were celebrating as a victory from a different angle. The takedowns did not put a dent in Baltimore's $900 million heroin market. After Peanut King's territory in East Baltimore opened, it descended into competitive chaos. The government had eliminated the Kingpin. The market had survived. The violence had increased. The same paradox that would eventually make The Wire such devastating television, that removing individual operators doesn't eliminate the conditions that produce them, played out in East Baltimore in real time after Maurice King went to prison. And nobody made a documentary about it. Nobody wrote a book about it. It just happened. While Peanut King sat in a federal facility serving a sentence that would last nearly 4 decades. 2 decades after Peanut King's arrest, David Simon sat down to write a television series about Baltimore. He had spent years as a Baltimore Sun crime reporter. He had written The Corner, a book about a West Baltimore family consumed by the drug trade. He had seen from the inside what the drug economy did to neighborhoods and families, and the specific human beings caught inside it. He wanted to tell that story on television. He needed characters, and the characters he built, the characters that would make The Wire the most acclaimed television drama in American history, drew directly from the men who had shaped Baltimore's drug trade. Avon Barksdale, the organizational genius, the man who ran the towers. He sat at the top of a management structure so sophisticated that law enforcement struggled to understand it. He had a boardroom mentality applied to the street. He maintained discipline across a complex operation through the force of his personality and the specific respect his name commanded. Stringer Bell, the business mind, the man who wanted to take the drug trade corporate. He read economics textbooks and attended community college classes and dreamed of taking the money generated on the corners and investing it in legitimate enterprise. The organizational sophistication of the Barksdale organization, the computers and the management structure, the specific personality of a man who was simultaneously a street figure and a CEO, all came together in those characters. Seth Ferranti, the true crime writer whose Guerrilla Convict publishing house became the definitive source on American drug history, said it directly. The characters in The Wire were based off his persona and exploits. His name was Maurice Peanut King. Every person who has ever watched The Wire, every person who has argued about whether Avon or Stringer was the better character, every person who has quoted Omar Little or McNulty or Bunk, every person who has told someone the show is the greatest television drama ever made, has been watching a story built on the life of a man from East Baltimore who drove a DeLorean and ran $50 million per year from an executive boardroom with computers. 2019, 2 duffel bags, a halfway house door closing behind him. Maurice King stepped back into Baltimore, 65 years old, with none of the things that the man who drove a DeLorean through East Baltimore had accumulated. No diamonds, no furs, no boardroom, no jungle mist, no DeLorean, just 2 bags and the specific dignity of a man who has paid for what he built. 37 years. He had gone in when Ronald Reagan was president. He came out when Donald Trump was president. The world that existed when he was arrested had been replaced by a world he had watched through a prison television for nearly 4 decades. Across Baltimore, people recognized him. On Instagram, people flashed greetings when they saw he was home. Donald Carter spotted him on North Avenue and came over. because Baltimore never forgot. Baltimore does not forget the men who shaped it, not the politicians, not the athletes, not the musicians, and not the kingpins. He appeared as a featured guest at a charity rap concert at the Petapsco Arena. The man who built the most sophisticated drug operation in Baltimore history was invited to speak at a charity event. He does unity engagement walks now through the same neighborhoods he once controlled, past the same corners where his product once moved, talking to young men who are standing where he once stood, making the same calculations he once made about what the legitimate economy was offering versus what the underground economy was generating. His message is direct, without sentimentality, without the kind of romanticization that ex-drug lords sometimes use to make their stories sound more heroic than they were. He says, "Don't let me be your future," not "I regret nothing," not "the system was against us and we did what we had to do." Don't let me be your future. The man who drove a DeLorean through East Baltimore while running $50 million a year, telling the young men on those same corners the truth about where that road ends. 2 duffel bags at 65, halfway house, the same streets, the same corners, different message, $900 million. That is what Baltimore's heroin market was worth annually when Peanut King ran it. 3 times what the city spent on its schools. 3 times. The same children who were being failed by an underfunded school system, who were looking at a legitimate economy that offered them nothing visible, were growing up in neighborhoods where the most successful man they could see was driving a DeLorean and wearing diamond rings and buying women $1,800 silk dresses in Beverly Hills. That is not a defense of what Peanut King built. It is an explanation of why someone builds it. Maurice King looked at East Baltimore and saw a market, an organizational challenge, a supply and demand problem that he was uniquely positioned to solve at a quality level nobody else was matching, with an infrastructure nobody else was building, with the specific organizational genius that federal prosecutors would eventually describe in court documents that read more like business case studies than criminal indictments. He built something extraordinary. He also built something that fed addiction across the East Coast. That brought heroin into 20,000 Marylanders' lives. That contributed to the deterioration of the neighborhoods he grew up in. Both things are true simultaneously, and the federal judge who sentenced him to 50 years understood exactly what he was sentencing. You were dealing in human misery. 7 words, carried for 40 years by the real Avon Barksdale, the man The Wire was built on, the man who drove a DeLorean through Baltimore while supplying the whole city. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them.